So if you go with the whole idea that what drama consists of is change. There is no drama without change. Change in many, many different ways, in behavior, in energy mainly. You have the word change cushioned and rewritten in many different ways. You can call it art, you can call it movement, as I said, you can call it energy, but drama is change. And what is rewriting other than change? It is the most fundamental change that a writer faced. You have worked for months or for years to put together a first pass of ideas down. Sometimes it comes from the gut, sometimes it comes because it's an assignment. But in any case, you've poured out whatever you got. And here comes this moment where you have to attack your first major rewrite. Not the cosmetic rewrites that we all do along the way just to clarify what we're doing at this moment, but the moment where you really have to step back and say, what the hell have I been doing, and does this work? Does this really, really work? And it's a huge moment of change for the writer, because what we are asked to do, in a way, is doing two contradictory things at the same time. We are asked to look at our work and say, how does that communicate to the world? So we are asked to be aware of the audience in a very, very active way. At the same time, we are asked to jump into the character and create an emotional consistency for the piece, which actually means exactly the opposite. You have to become incredibly aware of the internal works of the piece. And it's a very challenging moment. And the only real way of handling it is to trust the power of the character, and to trust the power of the emotional truth of the character. If you're able to follow that through, then the actions are going to follow, and then the emotional clarity for the people on the other end of the table, the people reading the piece, is going to be much, much easier to be grasped. So knowing that, now comes the issue of technique. And there are two big stages of rewriting. There is the clarifying the intent stage of the rewriting, and there is the execution part of the rewriting. The clarifying the intent part of the rewriting has to happen, and I'm sure you're all going through it right now, in terms of what do I mean, what do I want, what am I trying to get out. Then comes the even harder part of, okay, once the intention is clear, does that come across? And are there issues that the piece is dealing at that moment? So the moment you trust your intent, you have to allow yourself to doubt your execution. So again, of course, it's a very challenging moment, and what we're going to do is we're actually going to use this moment and examine Children of Men, which the draft is at exactly that stage that we're going to look at. I don't really know how far back from the production it's dated, but it looks like a very early draft to me. And however, the thematics of the piece are all there, and the major plot and premise is all there. What is tremendously in trouble is the character. And we will identify together where those issues are, and of course how they get resolved in the piece. So some of you have seen the film, correct? So what are the major thematic issues that the film deals with? It's a film about life and death, correct? It's a hope, right? And it's a film, the character's movement, the character's thematic movement is a movement of awakening, correct? So it starts from a man who is locked down and he transcends. It is, a Rick, huh?
Sacrifice.
Sacrifice, yeah, to some extent. Through the awakening comes the potential of sacrifice, exactly. And there is a healing. There's a healing element. If he can heal, he can take care of the situation, even in detriment to himself. Then there is healing with himself. So then you start with a character who is sort of like a Rick in Casablanca. I need to survive. I don't give a damn about anybody. And you get to the place of life is not worth living unless you really live it in regard to the people around you and in connection with the people around you. So all of that is clear in the draft, and the main plot of this society in 2024, I believe, in London, the world is infertile. It's been infertile for 18 years. It's coming apart because there's a lot of violence since there's nothing to hope for. And here comes this man who has basically given up on life and given up on himself. There's a sense that he has a personal tragedy that has even augmented the emotional experience that he's having. And he has one lovely friend who's sort of keeping him alive on some level because he's providing a zest of life, and he's the zest of life of the film. And here comes the inciting incident. The guy gets kidnapped, and it turns out that it is his former wife, part of a rebel group that has kidnapped him. And here comes the call to adventure. She comes back to life. He has thought of her dead all these years. They were activists together. Now she's come back to life. She's asking him on a metaphorical level to come back to life, creating the complications of the film. So the setup is very clear in the pages, the thematics are very clear. So let's take a look at what the issues are. And I would say that for you, as you look through this draft, but also as you take this whole conversation that we're having and apply it to your drafts, try to remember sort of a golden rule of three big things. You have to try, and it's all about trust, because we have to trust our instincts while we undo this piece. This process is a process of discovery, but also of huge trust. So you have to trust in the power of change, because if change is not present in the story, nothing is going to happen, and you're going to lose your audience. So allow it to be there, and do not hold back or detach from the power of it and the difficulty of it, psychological or logistical. Trust the emotional truth of the piece. If the emotional truth of the character is there, they are going to tell you the steps that are true, and then thus your audience is going to stay connected. And trust the image. Trust the image and the use of the image, and lift the piece off the language. If theme and character are the two things that really tie a piece together, theme lives in images. It does not live in language. No one really can tell you what a film is about, but the way that the situation unfolds and the images chosen will tell you what the film is about. So if you keep those three things in mind, it helps clarify a little bit the whole process of making decisions. So let's take a look at the draft. So starting with the opening, always a crucial thing. We're going to run through verbally through the draft, identifying issues, and then we're going to go and watch. So bear with the repetition. Hopefully, it will sear some things in your brains, because there is variation. Trust me. So the opening scene, as I said, always important to be quite aware of what you're putting down on the page. Part of the opening is supposed to put the audience in the mood of a world. In a mood of a world, and in a mood of a thematic lineup of issues. And in this particular case, we also have the introduction of the main character. So what do we have? We have a TV voice, which immediately starts talking about the world. The TV voice by itself is an element of the world at large. And you have a coffee shop where there's a lot of men and women sitting glued to the screen while they're listening to this huge crisis in everybody's life. What has happened is the youngest person on the planet has been killed, has been murdered, and everything is up for grabs. We learn a lot of information about who this person is. We learn that there's a cult of celebrity around him. And as we learn all that, and the whole world is mesmerized by the TV, in comes introduction of our character, Theo, who is completely in opposition of all of that. He doesn't give a damn. You know, if you had a line at that moment, that would be his line. And he cuts right through, gets to the counter, gets his coffee. He gets a black coffee, no frills. He has his exact change, no interaction, in and out, while we keep hearing about the world being turmoil, about the celebrity status of this youngest person who has died. And we get a sense of violence, because not only was he murdered, but the person who murdered him was lynched afterwards. So we are quite clear that there is this sense of violence in the world. And we also end with a sense of stakes, meaning that the way that this dead person is eulogized is by giving the exact length of his life up to minutes. And just by that choice, which is an interesting and precise choice, you get a sense that this is pretty serious, because you haven't really heard of anybody being eulogized down to the minute of their death. So moving on really quickly, just to take a glance at the outline. The way that you would want to abstract this scene would be, and bring it down to a short little outline level, would be to really call on what is crucial for the scene. There's a lot of details, if you look at the way that the draft runs, but you kind of want to highlight for yourself as a writer, pretending you're writing this outline, the really crucial elements, which is that there is a hopelessness, which is that there has been the murder of the youngest person, that the introduction of the character really highlights him as an outsider and as a detached element of this world, and that the violence and the direness of the situation leaves him untouched. And you kind of want to mark that for yourself, even being a little bit overdone or pedantic, just to make sure that you emotionally know how you move this person into the world of the scene and how you leave the scene with him, so that you stay emotionally connected by forcing yourself to put down the fact that he's not touched by anything that is going on in the cafe. Now, moving on to the second scene, complicating the situation, he leaves the world, and we get an extra little touch of character, which is that he is taking his coffee and he stops a few steps away from the cafe and he pours in some whiskey from a flask. He has a flask on his body. So his detachment gets one step further. We have branded him as a detached character by his behavior in and out, and now here comes the little flask action underlining that. The world is described in quite a detail. Once we get to the film, you'll see that it's done much faster, but it's basically a world in decay. It's a world that is embodying the thematics of the film. It's falling apart. It's almost dead. Trying to survive its last years. And as he's putting as he's using the flask in his coffee, comes the big bomb that shatters the world of the cafe, brings out the victims, and brings the violence close to him. So far, so good. We will see there's always an issue of how to get across information that is necessary for the piece, but it is a bit too much because there's so many details there. And one of those issues comes in this first scene, the way that the TV voiceover is used. It's all interesting stuff, but I would like you to question and look at it carefully. How much of that do you really need? And we will see how the film treats the same issue. So the elements that the TV voiceover covers are there, but they're done much more economically. We'll see how. So the world has been shaken, our character has been close to danger, he has survived. And then the next thing, of course, comes the question what does he do? What does he do next? And here he is on a train going somewhere. We do not know where he's going, but we know he's on a train, we know he's going somewhere, and we know that the world continues to be shit. He's in a train that has steel mesh over the windows, and there's violence outside. And the scene continues on. He's just sitting there looking shell-shocked out the window, while there are these two cops that tell you this whole story about how dangerous the world is, and this character, Rick's boy, has gone through all this trouble, and they talk about the different gangs that exist in the world, while they pop some pills, and you realize, this world is really subsiding on alcohol and pills, okay, fair enough. And they continue on talking about these stories. They end with giving one piece of crucial information, which is to say, well, at least England is still alive. The rest of the world is like shit, but and it's hell out there, but at least we are, we are set apart. Now, just from what I've described and you glancing at the scene, can you tell a problem with the scene?
Too much dialogue?
Too much dialogue, and what does that do? Well,
Exposition.
exposition, but exposition about what? You know, it talks about a world that we have already seen in turmoil. It brings in two characters we're never going to see before. And they talk about Rick's son. Who the fuck cares about Rick's son? We're never going to see him. So, and while your main character is just sitting, staring out the window. So you kind of want to ask, well, what am I doing with this scene? What am I using this scene for? And if I'm building on information, where's the build-up? If I'm using it for a little interlude, it should be much shorter. So questioning the use of language and the use of language for giving information that sounds good, but really the question is, what is the intent? What is it really being used for? And moving on, our character leaves the train, arrives at the train station. There's one little line about policemen patrolling the platform, some with German shepherds. So there's a sense of a police state all around. And here comes Jasper, lovely introduction of a man who is larger than life and will not let this horrible situation put him down. And we get an understanding of friendship, but there isn't really much going on. It's just the first interaction. And then we enter a whole sequence, which starts on page 4 and continues all the way until page 7. So 3 scenes in the car, I believe, back to back, where Theo is basically sitting there and Jasper is talking. And the thing that is accomplished is you really get a sense for Jasper's voice. There's a playfulness. This is a guy who will make a joke out of anything. This is how he survives. And he also infuses the piece with some incredibly necessary humor. The first little scene is interesting to look at because it is a classic example of flat writing. Jasper asks Theo, many got killed. Theo says, I don't know, fuck, the place was packed. Who set the bomb? Fuck knows. My ears are still ringing. All of this is information we know. We've seen it. We've seen that the place was packed. We've seen that a lot of people were hurt. There's an echo of that visually in the prior scene. So all of this is wasted space. There's one little thing at the very end where Jasper identifies the piercing sound that hurts Theo's ears after the bomb, and he says, "You mean that E?" and continues sort of mocking it. And by that, what do we understand? We understand that this is a world where this is normal. You know, Jasper has been in a situation like that. Everybody has been in a situation like that. It's like a known thing. So that is an interesting detail because it adds an element of understanding to the world. We know that that bomb was not the only bomb to worry about. And then the second sort of little segment of the scene continues on. And again, it's the same kind of premise of, Jasper says, well, what did you do? Theo says, he left. Okay, we know he left. He talks about the bloody woman he's seen. Again, we've seen it. So there isn't really anything exciting or interesting until the very bottom of the page where Jasper again has this little glimpse of expression of character where he's joking and he's basically saying, I'm glad I didn't lose you together with baby Diego, that would be too much to bear. And there's an irony and a playfulness in that really defines the character, and I would dare say that if we were to hold on to something, that would be a moment to look at. Piece continues on. It continues on sort of like, again, with the playfulness of who baby Diego was. But again, through all of this, there isn't quite, that theoretically there is a friendship, but there isn't really space for playing with that idea. There is the marking of it, which again is very much a quality of an early draft. You're marking your territory. You say two friends in a car talking about how bad things are. Okay. Well, but how do we know they're friends unless there is something intimate and playful within that interaction that makes it more specific? And then there is an interesting moment in that last segment, the third repeated car scene, where there's an action that gives us a new piece of information. It's 3/4 down the page. They're driving and they're stopped, and there's actually these bushes that they have to clear in order to get to the house. And that's useful because there's an action in the scene, so you're breaking the monotony of the driving. You're also telling the audience they're going to a hideout. They're going to a place that is hidden from just everyday traffic. And this again highlights a bit more in a different way the danger of the world and how secluded and isolated these people are. But through that whole scene, Jasper, the only thing he does is he tells a joke. And the function of a joke is to introduce the concept of the human project, which is some sort of humanitarian organization, very nice, and to again emphasize the fact that he is a joker and that he jokes about awful things, and that he has a way of doing that. Now, what you'll see is interesting when we go and look at the film is that it's a very funny joke, it works, but right now, in the way that it's placed, it's dead, because it's not doing anything, it's just told while they're moving some bushes. You'll see how in the rewrite of the film, the joke is still there intact, but placed in a different scene and for a completely different purpose. It has a purpose in terms of bonding the characters as opposed to just introducing an idea. And then the last part of the sequence, before we get to Jasper's house, is used for contrast and for change. It changes the mood because Theo introduces the fact that there is a woman named Janice, and we understand that this is Jasper's thorn. This is his pain, this is his problem, it's his wife, and she's in trouble. There is something wrong with her. The problem with the scene is that once he tells us this, we understand this, and then right after we get introduced to her and we get an echo of what we've already learned in a way. So again, that's a place to notice and to examine, because there isn't really enough shift between the telling of the trouble and watching it in movement. So Janice, the elderly wife, is introduced, and so is this wall of photographs that gives a sense of her life, and she's sort of lost in the past. So okay, we mark her, she's a character lost in the past for some reason. And this is Jasper's weakness. This is his Achilles heel, is his care for this woman and the issues he has with her condition. Moving on, then there's a section between Jasper and Theo where Jasper continues to tell stories. And he tells another story about how he met this refugee guy in the forest, and he had gone through hell escaping from what we learn is a concentration camp in the area. And Jasper says, I wish I could help him, basically, but all these immigrants and refugees, they're in really deep trouble because the UK government, in order to keep some semblance of quiet and order, kills these people as they roam the countryside looking for asylum, basically. So he uses yet another story to put forth very valid points, that there's a danger in the world, that there are immigrant issues, and that there is this place, Bexhill, which is nearby, which is crucial plot-wise, because this is where Theo will end up from the middle of the film on, and this is where his transformation is going to take place. And it's introduced in the middle of this storytelling. And continuing on, Jasper theoretically keeps trying to open up his friend, offers him some pot, Theo says no. And Jasper again goes into another story about how he got the pot and how the guards at this Bexhill place are actually providing him with this, etc., 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 and isn't the world going to shit? And Theo's only offer in that whole interaction is to say, yeah, the dinosaurs had a pretty good run of it, but now it's our turn, and you know what? So be it. What are you going to do? So he shows up as a cynic, and that's really all there is to it. And the sequence ends with Theo revisiting Janice, so it's almost like a little bookmark of a thing. And he takes the hairbrush she's holding, brushes her hair, and in that moment his eye wanders, and in the pictures that she's looking at, he recognizes himself as a young man, sees this woman and this kid, there's a sense of activism, and there's a clear sense, okay, there is a past and there's a problem with the past. Okay, so let's stop here for a second and examine this first, this sequence up to here. This is the sequence that I broke down in the outline. So if you think of the way that I've been talking about it and the facts, sort of the actions that we already know have happened. And if you even look at the blackened one-liners within the outline, you will identify immediately the main issue with this first draft. He doesn't do a thing. He puts whiskey in his coffee, he takes a train, and he brushes a woman's hair. Lovely, 11 minutes. We don't really know much about this guy. And the question is, if this whole premise, if this whole film depends on the awakening of a hero, I really don't believe this guy has any bone of a hero in his body. So, and I really don't believe that he's going to be able to maneuver the kind of situation that the film is going to give him. The problem is that, you know, one can say, okay, well, but then he awakens and he really discovers this hit. But we don't believe it. You don't believe it because you haven't seen it. You haven't seen the seed, you haven't seen the wink, and you don't like him because there's nothing to like, because he's not doing anything, he's listening. The world is falling apart and he just listens. So this is the main issue of the draft.